The Journey of Sir Alberich Lichten. Day 3. Last night's sleep came to me much easier. I am feeling very well now, full of renewed energy, though I must admit, aside from the naval officers, everybody is beginning to get a bit restless. Ordon has taken to pacing across the deck and some physical exercises since apparently, quote, "You can only practice cantrips so many times before you start feeling the urge to turn the ray of frost back at yourself." I am unsure if the fact that tomorrow around midday is when we will reach landfall is helping time go by quicker or slowing it to a crawl. All I know is that no matter what, this final day of sailing cannot end soon enough. Pietro has begun theory crafting by himself, but he's never been good at solving things without another person to throw ideas at. Though I may have a devious idea on how to solve that. Hopefully, Alberich isn't too busy later on in the day. But, for now, I believe it would be a good time to catch up with him on his travels. Hear a few good stories. Learn what he's been up to. That sort of thing. Gods above! It turns out I've met Pietro before I became drinking buddies with him. It just so happens he owes me his life. Ha ha ha! Oh, if this hasn't stoked the fire in my heart to nearly boiling my blood, I don't think it's possible to do so any longer. I shall try to contain my excitement and write concisely. About 40 years ago, around the beginning of my military career, I was awarded with a Diva Medal by my colonel at the time, Colonel Runar. It was awarded to me after I was a part of a small company that invaded what was once an enemy camp located somewhere in the northern end of the country once known as Luyana, though now it has been fully integrated into the Empire of Senra. However, it was not always that way, and when I had first enlisted, we were still in the process of taming the more savage aspects of that country that constantly instigated skirmishes on our borders and attempted to sack any trade route that got too close to their ever-expanding claim of influence. I was just a simple warrior back then, one face among the tens of thousands that swore to keep the enemies of the Empire at bay. I had my eyes set on a promotion up to corporal as I thought the name suited me well. Corporal Lichten. It was always one of my favorite things to be called in my mind, but I digress. Suffice it to say that I had plenty of reason to give everything I had and more in this battle, as it was one of the final holdouts of a man who went by Turk. He was a vile creature, and one who was believed to be an initial inciting figure in the war, though through his unending levels of cunning he had managed to escape every attempt at capture during the 3-year-long ordeal. But now, there was nowhere left to run. We approached the encampment that morning, just as the sun rose. We had approached from the east, so the sun would be shining in the eyes of the archers as we charged forward, which I believed to have saved more lives than our commander ever thought possible. The bastards had apparently been saving the most diabolical tactics for the last defense, as the arrows they fired were tipped with some sort of paralytic poison that would shut down every muscle in your body, regardless if it stuck in well or not. I was not on the front lines. Some call that luck. I call it a horror show. Seeing my friends, my brothers and sisters, topple over as their legs stopped moving but the momentum carried them forward. Being forced to charge past them and hope that the clerics could drag them off the field as soon as they could. But knowing deep down that it would be too late for most of them. The only thing lucky about it was all of the arrows that flew wide, fired by blinded archers. Before I continue with this tale, I must digress a slight bit and tell you about myself. This was not my first battle, and was far from my first brush with death. And so, I had taken many steps outside of training to ensure that I would have the highest chance of survival when the time for my battle came. So, I enlisted the help of one of my distant cousins, one Joshua Aaron Dolrick. He taught me several things about being a paladin, as he had learned from his father, since paladinism was a very strong family tradition to the Dolricks. Most importantly to this tale, he taught me how I would be able to heal in a way similar to paladins. It was difficult, as he and I lived about a day's journey from one another, and we both were often busy every hour of the day. But we were also quite young back then, and not averse to practicing late into the night and sleeping very little. It's true what they say. The joys of being young are truly lost on the youth. But eventually I learned that in order to safeguard myself in battle, I must first take an oath. Joshua told me that this oath was to be the most important thing to me, and so I should devote myself to something I already loved. When he said this, I immediately asked, "Is there any way I can devote myself to the Empire itself?" I hadn't even thought before I spoke. He laughed to himself, a good, long, hearty laugh. I began to think I made a fool of myself, either in my suggestion or my eagerness, but he put his hands on my face and looked me in the eyes as he said, "You truly are no different from my father. Meet me back here in 8 days' time. He will lead you through your oath." And so it was. I had spent that week traveling home, taking care of some things that the army called at-home tasks. I believe that week was aiding in setting up for a citywide celebration, though, as previously stated, my memory is questionable at best. When I returned, I met the man himself, Sir William Joshua Dolrick. Tales I had simply heard about this man could fill up 10 of these journals easily. My own experiences with him could fill 20, I'm sure. But those are stories for another time. For now, suffice it to say, he taught me how to stay alive, whether it be against blades, poison, madness, or even fear itself. And more importantly than that, he taught me everything I know about chivalry and heroism. It's that knowledge that kept me alive that day. That, and the knowledge that I knew that if I could just get inside that hideout, I could find a Turk and slay him without question, and all the rebels would lay down their arms, and the killing could stop. This was the only thought running through my mind as me and my fellows charged through the arrow fire. I wish with every fiber of my being I could have stopped to help all the people I ran past. For a long time, a small part of me blamed myself for their deaths. I know that at the time I had the ability to save 3, maybe 4 of them if I took the time to stop. But then, what of any others who needed help later? What of any prisoners or different evil poisons those inside had coated their weapons with? I knew I couldn't stop. I reached the gateway, which they had obviously bolted shut. The walls were no higher than 12 feet, and so I thought to be the base of a ladder so that we might climb the wall and take it. I put my back against the wall, interlocked my fingers, and began hoisting people up, one after another. By this point, our own archers had for the most part pinned down theirs, and they had resorted to cowering behind the ramparts. But as our arrows ceased long enough for the enemy to begin a counter-barrage, our melee troops began to storm the walls. Apparently they had been in such a sorry state that their archers barely had a butter knife to each man for protection, and within a minute the wall was ours. Though don't believe for a second it didn't cost us. I remember the difficulty I had straining my eyes so that I could focus solely on those that were stepping up my arms and onto the wall, and deliberately trying to filter out the sight of so many of my brothers and sisters laying dead or dying on the battlefield I was now facing. Eventually, I was hoisted up the wall and saw that most of Turk's men had been slain, refusing to surrender, since they knew what awaited them if they would be brought to trial. Some surrendered, however. Those that did were sent back with the wounded to be taken care of by the clerics. Those of us that remained on the wall quickly regrouped and split into 2 teams. I was selected to go with the group that would be storming the main building, while the other group took the courtyard. Including me, my team consisted of 30 men. A relatively scant force, but one that would be more well-suited to combat within the close walls of a tower. There was a section of the walls that led straight into the tower, so we needn't step down into the yard below and could simply crouch our way over inside their base. By the time we got there, fighting had broken out in the yard below us, and we were able to stand and kick the door in without issue. They had, of course, been ready for this, and after a brief skirmish, the 13 that had ambushed us on the other side of the door lay dead, but so did 6 of us. For each of them, we sat them against a wall and laid their weapons across their lap, said a small prayer to God and Emperor, and moved on through the tower. As we moved quietly through the halls of the camp, we had Tadril on scouting duty, a halfling fellow with ears that could detect a gnat coughing. Through his ears alone, we were able to foil the many ambushes Turk's men had laid for us. That's not to say it wasn't a costly mission. Through the sacrifice of another 20 men and women, we had slain the last of their forces in various skirmishes. By the time we reached the final room in the tower, there were only 4 of us left. Me, Tadril, my good friend Yarrow, and the second in command, Zurich. By this time, everyone left was almost entirely spent. We don't know how many we had slain inside the tower, but it could have been no less than 120. But there we were. A heavy iron door with an opened padlock and cracked ever so slightly ajar, obviously taunting us to come in. We stood outside the door for a minute, shooting nervous glances at one another, but nobody could come up with an alternative. We knew Turk was in that room. I volunteered to be the one to open the door, so long as I could take Zurich's shield, as mine had been splintered by one of the more heavily armored assailants we came across. It was too heavy to push slowly, a fact I'm sure the vagabonds behind it knew. So I swung it open with as much force as I could, and I tried to immediately guard myself against any arrows that I was certain would start soon flying my way. But nothing did. Instead, I was greeted with the sight of something truly evil. Turk and 7 of his men were stood around a group of children, all tied up and gagged. Turk and his men had crossbows aimed at the children, and as the door opened and we all figured out what was happening, everyone froze. I remember he spoke in a very thick northern accent. "Welcome, Pitka. I am in no mood to waste any more time, so I will give you your ultimatum concisely. Either I kill these children and you kill me, or I kill you, release the children, and I go free. Choose now." Though the answer seemed obvious to us, my team and I remained in stunned silence for a breath too long. The bastard took this for hesitation and slammed the butt of the crossbow he wielded into the back of one of the children's heads, and they collapsed to the floor unmoving. Zurich stepped forward with his weapon stowed and his hands raised. Tadril followed soon after, and then Yarrow. They were unshaken, unflinching, ready to die for these innocents like any good child of the Empire would be. But my legs remained frozen. I felt like I was in that moment for years. The only thing that snapped me out of it was the sight of Turk raising his crossbow to smash another child's head, when something took hold of me. I called out for Turk to release the children first. He stood and stared at me for a minute before simply saying, "No, now line up to die." I told him, "You leave us with no guarantees the children will be released after." And a ruthless smile crawled across his face. "Then why don't you go last, boy?" Before I could protest, all of Turk's men had fired their bolts point-blank into the throats and hearts of my compatriots. I watched them fall, heard them sputter and choke as blood filled their throats and lungs, though they tried to make as little noise as possible. Whether for the children's future sanity, my final moments, or their own pride, I cannot be sure. But slowly, I watched them stop. Slowly, the faint sounds of panicked, choking death ceased. And I was left there alone and waiting death. Maybe it's a good thing we let the children go. After all, that's just more mouths to feed on the way to our next business location. I watched in shock as Turk and his men cut loose the bindings of the children and removed their blindfolds. I herded them all behind me, turning my back on the gruesome scene, trying desperately to keep their attention on the sound of my voice. I led them all in a soft prayer, the same I had given all of the soldiers that fell beside me that day. I begged for our Emperor to forgive our failures and allow us to live on as brothers in the afterlife. And that's about as far as I got before I felt the crossbow bolt pierce through my back. All of the pain I had imagined would be a part of being poisoned by one of the arrows outside couldn't equal a fraction of what it was actually like. To feel your heart stop beating, your lungs begin to collapse, your throat close, and every muscle in your body remain locked in place, unable to move. Panic set in immediately, as I did not wish for the children to worry, but I physically could not help but topple over onto my side. From behind me, I heard Turk speak. "Everyone grab the rest of the supplies. We're leaving. As for you, children, I'd recommend you run. There is nothing for you here." I listened in unmoving agony as Turk and his men collected their things and left. The children all cowered in the corner of the room. My friends and I lay there, dying or dead already, I had no idea, as I could not see them. And as soon as I heard the door slam shut, I used what little consciousness I had left to think about my training with William Dulrich. I remember him telling me how I would be able to neutralize poison in my veins, and I began working through the complicated process. As the veins in my body began to collapse and my mind started to fail, I channeled everything I had into neutralizing the poison in my heart and lungs first. Slowly, they started functioning. I felt my lungs inflate, and it felt like my ribs were stabbing through me. I felt my heart force cold blood through fallen veins, and it felt like they were on fire. I could not even grit my teeth to help get through the agony. Instead, all I could do was focus on the healing of my arm. Again, slowly and methodically, though now I could breathe and my blood was flowing, so there was no chance of suffocation nor heart failure. Eventually, I got my feeling back. I dragged myself around and propped myself up on the arm, trying to turn my body towards the children to make sure they were all right. I am unsure of what compelled me to do so, but I looked at Tadril very carefully. I'll be the first to admit I'm not an intuitive man, nor necessarily one who believes in divine intervention. But I know what blood gently spraying out of a wound means. It means there is still something pumping the blood. Apparently, they'd only put one bolt in his chest, assuming that's all that would be needed for a halfling. So I crawled over to Tadril with my one arm that I could move. Slowly, agonizingly, I dug my nails into the stone floor and grabbed the bolt. I yanked it out of his chest and dumped more healing magic into him than I had left in my body. It didn't matter if I died. What mattered was him living. After all, he had a family. As my vision faded and more of my healing magic was poured into Tadril's wound, the last thing I saw before closing my eyes and losing consciousness entirely was his chest slowly rise and slowly fall. I awoke later inside a triage tent set up in the camp. The assault on the yard went incredibly well, which was not surprising given Colonel Runar's ability to command. Stood at my side, though, were two very short fellows. One was Tadril, who had already been all healed up, and was showing a small half-elven boy some of his battle scars. He was focusing on the scars he received from fighting wyverns and wolves and sharks, though mostly he was showing the boy scars he had gotten from doing a little woodwork in his father's shop when he was younger. But the boy seemed intrigued enough that I wasn't going to call Tadril out on his blatant lies. Upon seeing I was awake, they both jumped on me and hugged me, thanking me for saving their lives. I was still in a state of shock, I think, as apparently I hadn't smiled, nor said anything in return. I simply stared at Tadril and the boy. I spent the next few days being treated and slowly healing myself and others when I could. I wasn't supposed to heal others, of course. The doctors told me that was much more strain on my body than I should be putting it through, but one simply cannot deny their nature. During those days, all but the half-elven boy had been transported to an orphanage in the capital where they would receive therapy, room, and board. The half-elf boy did not leave my side, and we began to talk, sometimes including Tadril, who was given some time off. I learned the boy's name, who, I'm sure you've guessed now, was Pietro. And it wasn't until about a week after he was sent off to live with his grandmother in Dustwich that I realized I had never given him my name. Again, I'm not one for belief in divine intervention, but something must have put the two of us back together. And to whatever that being might be, I thank you. I am also quite thankful that these pages are water-resistant. Had they not been, I'm sure I would have ruined half the pages with tears by now. I learned all of this while Pietro and I were drinking at dinner. I had asked him why he chose alchemy aside from just wanting to help cure diseases in the country he grew up in, and he told me, well, no, it wasn't just for diseases. When I was younger, I'd been kidnapped and eventually used as a ransom to let the man who stole us get away from the imperial authorities. And one thing led to another, and I watched a man get shot with an arrow that was dipped in some kind of poison that basically made all of his muscles seize up, even his heart and everything. And when I learned something like that existed in this world, I wanted to make sure it and poisons like it would affect as few people in the world as possible. I mean, it looked awful. When he said this, it was like I had gotten thrown off an airship. Several questions later, him and I were at a loss for words, even though so many things needed to be said. He asked what happened to me after, what happened to Turk, if I had run across anything like that afterwards, and, well, I told him everything. How the arrows were enchanted by some incredibly esoteric and strange means. How Turk had been hunted down a couple of years later, though unfortunately not by me. I told of his execution and the memorial service held for those who had died by his hand. And then I asked him how Dustwich had been, and how his grandmother was, everything like that. I had never been to Dustwich. Matter of fact, aside from when invading places and our current journey, I had never stepped outside of the Empire's borders at all. It was marvelous to catch up with him. I always know he was far too easy for me to get to know for it to just have been random circumstance. And now I know it's because we have been bonded for a very long time indeed. I will say it's still a little off-putting to see someone who appears so human to have aged so slowly, but elven blood is what it is. I suppose it didn't help that his elven side makes him age much more strangely than humans, seeing as how that skirmish was probably some 40-odd years ago now, and yet he's much closer to being in his mid-20s in terms of maturity, so no wonder we never recognized one another. Aside from that fun bit of knowledge, nothing much happened today. It was fairly standard, which I think is good considering tomorrow we reach the island, and I wish to be at peak performance when we get to land. I sense a growing tension between everyone here on the ship. The Admiral and his men will be staying aboard, making sure the ship isn't overrun with nasties while we're gone. It is a shame that Helrica was so busy throughout the full day, and I couldn't put my master plan into effect. Regardless, tomorrow we reach the final chapter in Sir Alberich Lichten's long story of triumphs.